Well, hi everyone, and welcome to this special edition of This Week in Global Development, hosted in partnership with Pivotal Ventures. I'm Kate Warren, Executive Vice President and Executive Editor here at Devex. And today we are talking about women's health, but not just as a health issue, but at its core about power, agency, and opportunity. When women can't access healthcare and their pain is dismissed or their needs are underfunded, it limits their ability to work and to lead and to influence decisions that shape everyone in our world. So, health is not just a siloed vertical, but it's really the foundation for participation, productivity, and leadership. And yet, women spend 25% more of their lives in poor health than men. This compounded by underfunded R&D, diagnostic biases that minimize women's pain, and policy gaps, climate and displacement crises, and really a global funding model that treats women's health as a niche issue, despite us being half the population. So I'm really excited to dive into this topic today on talking about how we can invest in women's health. It's not just about healthcare, but it's really about unlocking power because women are healthy mentally and physically. They can drive change in their families and economies and their communities. And I'm really delighted to be joined by two women who are doing just this. We have Haven Ley, who's the Chief Strategy Officer at Pivotal Ventures, which accelerates social progress through high impact investments, philanthropy, partnerships, and advocacy. And Cecilia Conrad, who's CEO of Lever for Change, which uses open calls for surfacing bold ideas and connecting donors and philanthropy with high impact solutions. So, today we're going to talk about how we can reimagine women's healthcare to reshape opportunity, not just for women, but for entire communities. So, Haven, Cecilia, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Haven, I'm going to start with you. Women's healthcare has been overlooked for centuries. This is not necessarily new, but maybe you can help us set the scene, help our listeners understand, what is the current state of women's health globally, and where are some of those key gaps and inequities that we're seeing?
It's a great question, and Kate, thanks again for having us on to talk about this issue. I mentioned earlier it's raining here in Seattle, so it's great to talk about something that feels a little bit more optimistic today, if we can get there. You, I think, set the scene actually quite nicely. This is not a new story in terms of underinvestment in women's health. This is millennia, and I think that there's important reasons not to gloss over why it's been underinvested in. I think it's for so long that women have been expected to make do, to soldier on, to buck up, and our pain and to some degree our suffering has been completely undervalued by society, maybe in large part because we are asked to buck up and, and soldier on. And that has resulted, as you had suggested, in a gender gap between kind of the years in which that men and women live in poor health. And I think there's a study just recently out that women live kind of 9 years in kind of ill health for the course of our average lives, and that's 25% more than men do. And that is a gap that's not to be trifled with. I think the underinvestment in women's health is most starkly characterized when you just think about putting kind of capital on the table and kind of capital, follows priorities. Only about 1% of the $200 billion in global health research, kind of outside of cancer research, kind of goes to your point, women's health issues, which is just a vast, vast underinvestment, kind of compared to that gap that you mentioned before about between men and women. That's like the old news. That's the standard bearer. That's not a great story. And I just have to start by saying there's another kind of more recent bad news story, which is that global AIDS has been, over the last 4 decades, a huge contributor to improving women's health globally. I mean, massive contributions to the reduction of maternal mortality, reproductive health access, etc. And I would say the new story on top of the bad old story is that the cuts and decimation of global aid, certainly in the United States, but more broadly, the reductions in that capital is going to have, and perhaps already is having, a negative effect on women's health, globally speaking. So we kind of have compounding problems right now that need urgent solutions.
May
Yeah,
I add
and
something
yeah,
to
go ahead,
that
Cecilia.
just a little? Because as I was thinking as Haven was talking, when we look at the underinvestment in women's health, I think we have to also acknowledge that a lot of that has to do with the historical pattern of undervaluing the work that women do.
Mm.
Because it's, historically not necessarily in the paid and formal labor market. But when a woman has a health issue, it impacts the family because she's unable to care for either the elderly or the children in the same way that she was before. It impacts nutrition in many countries because the women are the ones who are growing the food that the family eats. It has impacts that are much uh, broader than what I think have been traditionally acknowledged. So they're not necessarily the one bringing home a paycheck, and we've tended to focus on the paycheck bearer as the whose health is the most important, but that's just not
Yeah,
true.
great point. Great.
Yeah, and I think as you mentioned, Haven, just the, reduction in traditional global health funding has a lot of people wondering, "Okay, well, how are we going to fund these challenges?" And maybe also making and bringing to light that this is not just a health issue, it is an economic issue and a democratic issue and helping societies grow. And Cecilia, you are running these open calls, right, globally for, big ideas, and I think a lot of people are really looking at what are these big ideas and what are some innovative ways that we can do a lot with little and bring in other donors, whether it's other kind of capital and philanthropy. But I'd love to hear, what are some of the patterns you see in how maybe women's healthcare needs are being addressed or not by some of these traditional funding structures?
Yes, I think some of the traditional funding structures that exist kind of replicate what we just described in terms of not necessarily, typically it's a top down model. Someone decides, here's the problem. I want you to go work on this problem. And the people deciding the problem aren't necessarily identifying the problems that are most important to those on the ground, particularly the women who may not be represented in the decision making around that.
Mm.
And so by doing these open calls, we sort of flip this. First of all, we are providing a space to discover all of the initiatives and great ideas that may otherwise not come under the radar for institutional funders or individual donors. But we're also giving an opportunity, the space for those on the ground to tell us what the key problems are. And, we had earlier, we've run some open calls where women's health projects have been submitted, and it was interesting to see some of the topics that emerged, and we've seen this again with Action for Women's Health.
Yeah.
For example, there are, cervical cancer, menopause, um, postpartum depression. These are all critical issues that affect women's daily lives that have not historically been the topic of a big foundation initiative.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Haven, and you touched on this a little bit, but, this is not just about healthcare, but it's really about helping to expand women's power and influence, right? And healthcare really being the underpinning of being able to help women realize their power. And it's a double-edged sword, right? As you said, a lot of these issues are overlooked because women aren't making they're not at the decision-making table, right?
Yeah.
And so being able to invest in their health gives them the environment to
Yeah.
have more influence. So, yeah, I'd love to hear kinda a little bit more about that connection and why you see this art is so, fundamentally interconnected.
I mean, it's essentially interconnected. And maybe I'll bring Melinda French Gates into this picture because I think she's the one who's kind of painted this path for Pivotal and kind of engendered this approach and partnership that we have, the Letter for Change right now for Action for Women's Health. But listen, expanding women's power and influence has been the animating value of Melinda's philanthropy and leadership for her career as a philanthropist over the last 3 decades. Certainly, first the Gates Foundation, continuing at Pivotal, and now solely at Pivotal. Um, One of her practices as a philanthropist consistently and dutifully has been really deep listening. So she consistently goes out every year, multiple times a year, to go listen and speak to women mostly, who are either engaging in economic enterprise or running, in Pivotal's case, right, running for public office or thinking about caregiving solutions for their families. And, I think oftentimes she goes in to talk to families and to women, whether it's here in the United States or in the global South, about the thing. Talk to me about running for public office. Talk to me about economic development. I first got to know Melinda as a program officer working in smallholder citizens agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa. And we go talk to women farmers about what they were doing to raise poultry and to grow legumes. And inevitably that conversation would circle back around to health, kind of chronic issues, why they weren't having access to family planning, the Depo-Provera shots anymore, mental health and well-being for themselves and their families. So while we were beginning to engage them in these kind of other enterprises, that is the manifestation of women's power, running for public office, earning a living, earning your own wages, feeding your family, inevitably it came back to health, either as a barrier to manifesting that destiny or making these different economic choices, or because it was enabling them to do something different. And so I think for Melinda, and I think certainly for Pivotal, like these things go hand in glove together. I think there's another reason though, Kate, too, which is I think the Dobbs decision here in the United States, which actually saw a rollback of women's rights in the United States in terms of accessing reproductive decisions and choices, was actually a diminishment, right, of women's power as kind of codified by that ruling. And I think the degree to which you, again, have a diminishment of women's power, i.e., the power to control our own decisions about our bodies, is also another manifestation of how these two things are inextricably linked right now.
Absolutely. And so Pivotal and Lover for Change, you are launched this Action for Women's Health. It's a $250 million global open call to find and support organizations around the world that are working to improve women's mental, physical health. So I'd love to hear more about this. And, Cecilia, I think you've received over 4,000, is that right, applications from 119 countries.
Yes.
So obviously there's a lot of ideas out there. So can you talk about this model and what you're hoping to do with it?
Yes. So, as I said earlier, one of the real values in doing this open call is the opportunity for discovery. And the first step in that is to try and do a very broad outreach effort to make sure people know about the opportunity and that you have created a process that allows organizations of different sizes and types, representing different populations, to apply and be considered. And so we capture these initial set of applications. They then go through a participatory review where each applicant gets to read other applications and to use the rubric to score and comment on those. And this is a step in the process that turns out to yield a lot of value to the participants because they get a sense of what else is out there? What are some of the other good ideas that are being done? And they also get an opportunity to give feedback to each other that is sometimes more practical than what you might get from a panel that was more of a kind of academic or foundation program officer kind of panel. The second stage in the process is this what we call our expert panel review. That's a broad cross section of policymakers, implementers, academic researchers, people who are funders, who also then use this rubric to assess the proposals themselves. And then finally, we work very closely with the Pivotal team to help identify those organizations that are going to get these grants.
Yeah. And so, we were talking before about some of the changes, I guess, to the funding structures, traditional funding structures that traditionally have been a very top-down approach. This to me seems to be a very bottom-up approach and
Yeah.
being able to surface those ideas. So, yeah, Haven, maybe we could talk a little bit about how you see this approach being able to, better center equity and women's real needs in some of the solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is our second rodeo with Cecilia and Liver for Change. We partnered with them, Cecilia, what, 6 years ago, 7 years
Yeah,
ago?
yeah, I guess so.
And
Pre-COVID.
some of the early days of Liver for Change's model emerging. And we did it, Kate, just by way of context and history, at the outset of Melinda committing her first of kind of over $2 billion to this agenda of expanding women's power and influence. And we partnered Liber for Change then to think about like what were new solutions that people were doing domestically in the United States to think about expanding women's power. We had a great forum. The process was wonderful and equitable, as Cecilia has illuminated. And I think when Melinda committed her second billion to women's power and influence just last year and explicitly kind of carved out some of that capital to go to women's health, we immediately thought of Lever for Change as another way to think about getting voices, ideas, innovations, and leaders that we necessarily couldn't see from our fairly lean team here in Seattle, kind of up and out, and to draw some spotlight onto innovations that were at work now and simply need solutions. So the idea was that we were going to kind of invert and not come up with a top-down strategy for what we were going to do, for instance, on cervical cancer or another kind of issue related to women's health, but really unearth what was going on the ground and use some of those applications, and certainly the winner is to kind of think through trends. What are we seeing? What are we learning? What are these leaders and women and community members telling us about what matters for women's health on the ground right now? And that was really the animating principle to kind of go and partner Lever for Change like this at this time. And I hope we can talk about it a little bit. I mean, of the 4,000 applications, I think that completely exceeded Cecilia and I's wildest imagination. I mean, there was a lot of demand. And Kate, this was before a lot of the global aid cuts actually became fully
Yes.
known. So just to say that the demand was there and those thousands of applications from over 110 countries prior, we can only imagine what it would be like today. So I'm kind of imploring other funders to kind of think through what might be needed on the ground today. But we are seeing some interesting trends and lessons, and obviously new and innovative models that have existed for a long time that simply need more resources, right?
Yeah, and I want to get into what some of those are, but also just thinking about, Pivotal, you take this kind of multi-pronged
Yeah.
approach to, funding these community-driven ideas, also advocating for policy change, seeding innovation and investments. And, how do you see all of these levers, working together to augment the impact?
Yeah, I mean, this is really central to how we've set Pivotal up to be a multifaceted funder using different levers to think about the issues that we work on in a ecosystem approach. I think the reason to do it is like an acknowledgement that not one lever is going to make the difference. This is not silver bullet philanthropy. But also we really, really deeply are interested in durable and lasting change. And when you take an ecosystem approach, it means that the system itself is working together to create change. And so in this case, I'll just give you a couple of examples. You named it, like one way to immediately think about funding at scale a variety of different community-driven and community-designed models for women's healthcare and healthcare access is to do a partnership like we've done through Leverage for Change. Incredibly important for us to do that. Um, but there's other levers that also need to be pulled in the ecosystem of women's health, and we're pulling a few of them today, and we might do more in the future. Advocacy and policy change is going to be essential, both obviously domestically here in the United States and certainly globally. And we've been investing in long-term partners who kind of inform and educate policymakers about the importance of investing in women's health, really shifting those kind of resource priorities into a different place. So groups like the National Women's Law Center, the National Partnership for Women and Families are all great researchers and advocates to this end. We also have an investment arm at Pivotal, and so we will be investing in early stage companies and in venture capital funds that invest in early stage companies that support women's health, kind of using market-driven solutions. I mean, the market is another way to sustain change over time, and so we're investing there as well. And then most recently, and I think we just made this announcement, or Freemi Melinda made this announcement a few weeks ago, is that we will invest upstream. So we know that R&D does take time to engender new solutions for women, and you have to think about changing those capital flows to getting innovations that work for women, and some of that takes years. But we're a little bit more impatient than the usual R&D cycle, so we are partnering with Welcome Leap, and particularly with their CEO, Regina Dugan, who is wonderful, former exec of DARPA, to really think about how you accelerate R&D solutions using their really incredible innovative model. for issues that are plaguing women, but have been kind of completely discounted on the slow burn in terms of R&D innovation, like issues like chronic disease, hypertension, disease, osteoporosis, and menopausal treatments as well. So those are some of the levers that we're kind of bringing to bear, Kate, for women's health. And there will be more in the future that we'll have to look at.
Yeah, and I love, talking about kind of how to create, long-lasting change, not just, a short-term project that you fund and then the funding goes away and the project goes away. And so, Cecilia, your experience working with various funding models, where do you see the role of philanthropy and philanthropic interventions helping to play, or in creating that long-lasting, durable, sustainable change?
Well, first is the wonderful aspect of what Pivotal is doing here, in that we need something that works at every level. So we need the upstream research. We need the stage that develops that research into practical tools that can be used to address health. We need the organizations on the ground who need to be strong and resilient and need
Yeah.
durability in order to be able to make those innovations actually translate into improvements in health itself. And so what's critical there is that you have something happening at every level there. The second thing that's wonderful is the fact that this is largely flexible kind of funding.
Mm.
So it gives organizations the ability to figure out what they need to do to make the best decisions for what their situation in their community needs. And to do that with particularly the size of these grants, will give them something that looks a little more like durable capital. If you were a firm that was starting up, you would look at different types of funding at each stage of your operation. In the nonprofit world, philanthropy historically has done a lot at the beginning and then
Yeah.
kind of counted on something adopting it and it scaling on its own. But what's
The family
important
owners who come in behind, yes.
that's right, that's right. And so what's wonderful here is that these are grants that, relative to the size of these organizations, are significant enough to give the organizations the runway they need to develop, to solidify their work that they're doing, to perhaps share it with others. Because in this space, I think there's a lot of need for sharing best practices across organizations. So this is what's so exciting about this partnership.
And I want to talk a little bit about, I mentioned that the 4,000 applications, so many great ideas. And what are maybe don't not give away exactly some of the ideas, but what are some of the trends that you saw when you look across the totality of them? Haven, I'll
You want to start, Haven?
Can I start because I'm excited about a couple of them, and you can jump in. Um, two trends, or at least a really surprising number of applicants that came in, are related to two, I think, profoundly underinvested in areas of women's health. We talked about it being broadly underinvested in, and I think there's two that I think need special honors, i.e., the most neglected. And we saw a lot actually of innovations in these spaces. The first is on mental health. And I think we can agree that mental health, broadly speaking, mental illness is chronically underfunded, no matter who you are globally. There's a billion people suffering with mental illness around the world at any given time, and we contribute a paltry amount to
I
mental
feel
health
like it's
treatment
like
support. Yes.
1% of health funding, I think,
Nothing
goes
ever-
to mental.
Exactly, just paltry compared to the need. But when you actually kind of cut the data, women disproportionately are affected by a mental illness, and tying this back to kind of what are the knock-on effects for us all when women are suffering. It's like mental illness actually does pull women out of the workforce. It reduces productivity, and to Cecilia's point, even when you're not in the workforce, it certainly inhibits your ability to care and to contribute even to your family and your community. And so we know that women, for instance, are twice as likely to suffer from clinical depression, like a major driver of global disability worldwide. And in times of emergency, where women are often the backbone of ensuring that there is family and community survival through emergencies, like women are the ones who are expressing, deep, deep clinical crises and depression. And in a more minor way, right, in the United States, women were 3 times as likely to describe those feelings during the pandemic for reasons we can probably I'll imagine. So we did see a lot of really interesting innovations for mental health, both standalone treatments, but also integrated treatments, i.e., physical health models that were integrating mental well-being models as well. Super exciting for me. Second one I'll say is also underfunded, but maybe this is changing, and I'll give a weird anecdote to see why I think that's true, is the physical effects of women aging. I think I'm in my, like, late 40s. These things are happening to me. Brain fog, inability to sleep and concentrate, like, real things that inhibit my quality of life and my productivity. I mean, I was talking to my mother about them, just kind of asking for advice of how she navigated through her own menopausal life, and she didn't have much to say. "Well, I kinda just put my head down,
Mhm.
It's the
and I
bucket up that
That's
you was
right.
talking about.
Exactly, buck up. I didn't really talk to my doctor about it. I didn't think he would have much to say, and I didn't really talk to my friends about it. Now, that lack of awareness, knowledge, solution set is changing. There's more of a conversation around the quality of life for women and aging. But as Cecilia mentioned, like, we did see solutions working on this problem that had come up through Lever for Change applications. So while we might not be talking about it or prioritizing investment in it, there are solutions and innovations working right now trying to support women through it. And I will say that, there's going to be a billion women who are going to live through their postmenopausal lives in the next 5 years, and that number is only going to increase as our societies age. If we don't start thinking about solutions to these problems, it is going to have a knock-on effect on the economy, never mind our quality of lives. So those are just two kind of really interesting trends that I saw that I'm quite excited about.
Well, I'm excited here that I think my group of friends and I that are all our mid 40s to early 50s have a like our perimenopause chat, right? And that's where we're getting a lot of our healthcare. It's through community, through each other, because
Yeah,
we can't get it from the traditional healthcare
yeah,
systems, and it's such a market potential. You would think as
huge.
well, and
Absolutely.
you see a lot of this happening. I think more in the global north, but less, I think, in some of the global south conversations. But I mean, it is an economic challenge. So happy to hear there's some good ideas there. Cecilia, what about you? Or any trends that have stuck out to you?
I was intrigued by some of the organizations that are working in the intersectional space,
Mm.
the ways in which health challenges may manifest themselves differently for women who also have disabilities, uh, the need for culturally responsive mental health care, uh, the focus on some populations, like what happens when you're a refugee and there's this health crisis. I was intrigued by many of those and found those really exciting.
Well, I know that we are going to be spotlighting some of the winners of this in some future episodes of our podcast. So, really look forward to learning more about those ideas and being able to share them with our community. But before we wrap up, I would just love for each of you to kind of share what you would love for our listeners to take away and think about as it relates to really investing in women's health and the power of that, both in helping women but also communities. And Haven, I'll start with you.
Well, listen, I appreciate the time, and I think, another reason why Pivotal has partnered Live for Change in this way is also because Live for Change does an incredible job um, capturing and spotlighting all of the incredible kind of vetted projects that come through kind of their incredible process. It makes it really easy for other donors who might have an interest, but have a very small kind of apparatus to giving. It makes it really easy to access high quality, fully vetted due diligence projects. And I think one of the reasons that we're really excited about doing this is that we hope that while we'll contribute kind of this incredible $250 million amount to a host of winners, those winners, need more capital than we're able to give them. And there are some groups who did not emerge as winners from this challenge, but who also are incredibly deserving of capital and resourcing. And they're doing the work today as we speak, sitting on this podcast. They are out there in their communities delivering health services to women in communities, and they need additional resources now. So honestly, Kate, part of this is a bit of a call to action that donors don't need to pull back. need to lean forward. There are easy ways to get capital where it needs to go if you care about kind of rethinking how resources are prioritizing women's health. And I really think that donors should act boldly, act urgently, and start moving the capital as needed right now.
And the ideas and the works there. Just
It's all there.
What are you waiting for?
Yep.
yeah, Cecilia, how about you?
I I I have to double down on what Haven said. I was going to make the point that, our work on this particular open call does not end when the awardees get announced. We will be working with the organizations over time to help strengthen their case for funding, to help elevate them with other fundings, und other funders. We stand ready to provide information to any donor who wants to kind of find something now and act now because the need is now. So I'm hoping that people will heed this call to action and reach out.
Great. Well, that's it for today's conversation. I'm really excited that we will be continuing it and we will be spotlighting some of these grantees and the really amazing the work they're doing in future episodes of This Week in Global Development. So for our listeners, make sure you're subscribed and you stay tuned for those stories to come. But in the meantime, hey, Van Cecilia, thank you so much. This was a really lovely, enjoyable conversation. And thank you to Pivotal Ventures for helping us really spotlight the importance of this work. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in.